There's this meme that's been floating around since last year, I think. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's the idea of the sensitive young man. I'm sure you've seen it all over Twitter and probably other social media platforms. And this idea isn't new at all. It's existed for actually decades. But the form in which it's been expressed is kind of new, obviously. It's taken on a sort of new shape as opposed to the other shapes that it's previously assumed in the past. Essentially, the idea of this sensitive young man is this young man who is basically misunderstood, sort of has very high ideals for the world, but the world doesn't conform to these ideals, and because of that, he finds himself often discontent with these ideals. Now, we've seen characters like this in movies before, actually. Taxi Driver is a perfect example of that. Notes from the Underground, the main character in that is sort of like a similar kind of person. Raskolnikov, and I'm going to stop talking about Dostoevsky because it's beginning to make me kind of look like a Sood, and I don't want to look like a Sood, but those are legitimate examples in this case, I would say. But this idea has been around for well over 100 years, but there needs to kind of be an understanding of this idea, but this idea of like the sensitive young man, that's basically this man who's going through the world with a plethora of ideals that are not met, and because of that he finds himself sulking in his own misery. I don't think that's a good thing to idolize. I think a lot of people have idolized that, but it's understandable why they've idolized it, because they don't really see any other option besides sort of embracing this identity of this man who is detached from the world. And I think we kind of need to reform where we want to take this idea of the sensitive young man. I think the sensitive young man should turn into the angry young man or the discontent young man. And it's not as if he isn't those things. He is those things, but hasn't recognized those things fully in himself yet. There's no virtue in simply being sensitive or aware to things. There is virtue in being aware and sensitive to these things, insofar as you're willing to do things to change the way in which the world works. And that's why I think the sensitive young man slowly has to become and realize himself as the discontent young man. Once he does this, then only he'll basically be able to have the ability to act in a way that'll facilitate actual radical social change. Now, I think the purest way of understanding the sensitive young man idea is through Hegel's concept. And I know it's funny to say that the simplest way of understanding something is through Hegel. That's usually never the case, but I can try to explain it in a very simple way using this idea he has of the unhappy conscious. And basically this unhappy consciousness is a split, or maybe a discrepancy, I guess is a better way of putting it, between the ideal that self-consciousness has for itself and its experience of itself and perception of itself as it's acting in the world. That is also part of being the sensitive young man or the discontent young man, is that you have this ideal not only of the world and of others, but also of yourself and who you want to be and how you want to be in the world. And then when that's not fulfilled, and when that ideal comes to be destroyed through acting through the world, you have this sort of underlying unhappy consciousness. And the only way to resolve this unhappy consciousness is to act out your ideal as much as possible. And through acting out your ideal, you're going to discover two things. One, you're going to discover that perhaps your ideal the whole time wasn't actually truly what your ideal should have been, and you may abandon the ideal in pursuit of a higher ideal. The other thing you might understand through trying to actualize this ideal is that perhaps the ideal that you were trying to actualize, or that you were holding the whole time in your consciousness or your mind, or however you want to put it, was not actually what you thought it was. And that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to abandon it, but you may. But you can develop a new perspective. It can have a new sort of way of existing for you as you try to actualize it. And I think that's also something that needs to be taken into consideration when we speak of this idea of taking our ideals and acting upon them and imprinting them upon the world of objects, the objective world outside of our mind. Of course, a lot of this is just posturing to people to try and look a certain way. There's a certain aesthetic to it, right? There's people like to be the Travis Bickle. People like to be, the Kafka kind of character, or whatever you want to call it. This is like a very popular thing amongst young adults, specifically men in the age range between, I would say, maybe 19 and 25, roughly speaking. I guess if you're older than that, if you're older than 25 and you're idolizing the idea of a sensitive young man, which is bad to begin with in and of itself, but if you're doing that past the age of 25, then you might need to reevaluate what's going on in your life. But the broader point that I'm trying to make is that simply being sensitive isn't enough. You need to actually go forth and change the world. Now, How do you do that? It's not so easy. You can't just wake up one day and say, I'm going to change the world. I mean, it would be a noble pursuit, but somewhat delusional, of course. And I'm going to repeat myself here because I've said this in other videos, but I don't think there's anything wrong with repeating yourself if what you're saying is of value and is true. The only way for the sensitive young man or the discontent young man, which is what we want to make the sensitive young man realize, the only way for him to actually actualize himself and live out his potential is through communion with other discontent young men who share a common ideal. That's how all change in the world has occurred and can occur, actually, is through collective action with the sort of veil or the shared notion of a better state of affairs for society.